Are you an executive or manager whose company needs to comply with PCI DSS, but you don't have the time to dig into what PCI DSS is? Or maybe you have the time, but you dread looking into the material because you anticipate it being dry and boring? Well, guess what? It is dry and boring. But lucky for you, we've done the boring research, boiled it down, extracted the main pieces, and will present you PCI DSS in plain language in around 30 minutes. My goal is that by the end of this video, you'll feel confident that you understand the primary elements of PCI DSS and can speak intelligently to it. So, PCI DSS, it's a 6-letter acronym. What does it stand for? Well, PCI DSS stands for the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. It's a list of standards for how to handle sensitive credit card data inside your organization. Okay, that's nice, but where does it come from? Well, PCI DSS comes from PCI SSC. Now you're probably thinking, great, more acronyms. Well, now what does this one stand for? Well, PCI SSC stands for the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council. PCI SSC was created to develop and manage security standards for the credit card industry, and PCI DSS is the vehicle they work through to do that. Okay, again, that's nice, but the next question is, who created PCI SSC then? Well, the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council was created in 2006 by a collaboration between Visa, MasterCard, JCB International, Amex, and Discover because they recognized the need to have security standards for protecting credit card data across the industry. So to review, PCI DSS is a set of security standards for the credit card industry, and it stands for Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. PCI DSS was created by and is managed by PCI SSC, which is otherwise known as the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council. PCI SSC was formed in 2006 to develop and manage security standards for the credit card industry, and PCI DSS is their vehicle through which they publish their standards. Now, finally, the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council was created by a collaboration between Visa, MasterCard, JCB International, Amex, and Discover. Now, I'm really foot-stomping this because I want you to have a good handle on where all of this guidance is actually coming from. So now that we know where PCI DSS came from and why, what is the actual guidance that it gives us? Well, PCI DSS gives us 12 data security standards to apply to each organization that handles credit card data. Now, instead of simply presenting you this list of standards and calling it good, we'll help you out by going through each one individually and providing a clear explanation of each. This way you will gain a thorough understanding of what PCI DSS is actually asking you to do. So let's jump into Standard 1. Standard 1. Install and maintain network security controls. For managers, this means you need to isolate and control access to different portions of your network, making it difficult for a hacker to jump from one section of your network to another. This standard also implies other security controls like login banners and router passwords, but for now we'll focus on the isolation piece. To illustrate this idea, let me tell you about the time I worked in a building that contained classified information. I used an ID badge in combination with a personal PIN to access the front door. However, there was another room located inside the building that contained the actual classified data. This interior room was isolated from the rest of the building and protected by another door with its own badge reader and keypad. This was done so that even if someone were to break in the main front door, they would still have to figure out how to break through the second interior door behind which was kept the most sensitive information. We can apply this same idea of isolation and protection to computer networks. For instance, your sales employees need access to their computer, a printer, and the internet, but they probably don't need access to human resources network, which contains a lot of PII. Because of this, IT will often protect the HR computer network from everyone else using things called subnetting, VLANs, and/or internal firewalls. This is done so that if a hacker breaks into your network, they have multiple other barriers they must circumvent to access the sensitive HR data. Standard 1 of PCI DSS wants us to protect systems with credit card data using this same sort of strategy. So as we said prior, to meet this standard, your IT professionals will install and maintain internal firewalls, routers, subnets, and VLANs to isolate and protect systems with credit card data. And remember, in addition to controls meant to isolate, they will also set up passwords and something called a login banner on sensitive systems. Now we'll look at Standard 2. In 2023, the FBI reported that a number of U.S. water treatment facilities were hacked because they had devices open to the internet with default passwords of 1111. Now, obviously this was a bad oversight, and a checklist of secure configurations could have helped them avoid this. This is why PCI DSS gives us Standard 2. Apply secure configurations to all system components. This standard is essentially talking about security configurations that are really actually just best practices. What are some secure configuration practices you are already familiar with? Well, think about your Wi-Fi password at home. A Wi-Fi password is a security configuration for your home router. A lock screen on a cell phone that requires a PIN is a secure configuration for your cell phone. How about when you log into your bank account online? Does it send you a temporary PIN that lasts only 5 to 10 minutes? That's a security configuration for your bank account. These are examples of security configurations that most people are familiar with. Standard 2 requires us to apply the same approach to company networks and devices. The main difference is that the network devices and computers at your company are more specialized. The security configurations they need are unfamiliar to many people. So IT will adhere to this standard by implementing common enterprise security configurations like applying vendor patches to software, changing default passwords, and removing unnecessary software, to name a few items. So to circle back to the example at the beginning, having a secure configuration checklist for internet-facing devices that included changing default passwords would have kept those water treatment facilities I mentioned from being hacked. Now let's explain Standard 3. Protect stored account data. I read about a guy that had his apartment broken into, and the burglars stole about $50 worth of cash and some cheap jewelry, and that was about it. The owner considered himself lucky because he had $35,000 worth of cash in a safe on the floor of his laundry room, and the thieves completely missed it. Well, how did they miss it? Well, the guy hated doing his laundry, so he had a very large pile of dirty clothes completely covering the safe. The burglars didn't think of digging through the pile of clothes, so they missed out on the cash. While I don't advocate for anyone hiding their valuables in a pile of dirty clothes, this guy did protect his stored valuables by 1, locking them up, and 2, hiding them where a burglar could not find them. PCI DSS Standard 3 asks us to do the same thing with stored customer credit card data. Hide it and protect it. As alluded to in the example, this is basically about controlling access to credit card data like it is a valuable object at your home. You guard your birth certificate at home, right? You probably do this by 1, hiding it so it's not in plain sight, and 2, controlling access to it, which is normally done by locking it up in a safe. Your IT professionals will comply with this standard by utilizing encryption on your stored credit card data, masking any credit card data in event log tools like Splunk or Elk, and restricting access to credit card data and requiring that those with access authenticate before they can see the data. For those unfamiliar with the term masking, think about when you purchase something using your credit card, and the receipt has the first 12 characters of your credit card represented as stars or dots. That's an example of data masking, which is one piece of what this standard is asking us to do. Now on to Standard 4, Protect cardholder data with strong cryptography during transmission over open public networks. This one is pretty straightforward. It requires organizations to use the latest encryption algorithms to protect data as it travels over easily accessible communication networks, like the internet. This way, even if a hacker grabs a portion of the transmission data, they still can't read it. For those who don't know what encryption is, encryption works by transforming data into alphanumeric patterns combined with symbols, rendering it unreadable to anyone who intercepts it. As a result, even if an attacker gains access to the data, it remains useless to them. This is akin to someone handing me my car owner's manual written in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Sure, I have the owner's manual, but I don't know how to read Egyptian hieroglyphs, so I would essentially have no idea what the manual says. Here's an example of a phony credit card number being encrypted. In the top red box, the number starting with 1111 is the pretend credit card number. And in the bottom red box, the alphanumeric pattern with symbols is that same number but with encryption applied. Notice how there is no way that I'm going to be able to decipher the number 11112222 and so on from the pattern at the bottom just by looking at it. This is a simple example of how encryption works. Back to Standard 4. Standard 4 is just telling executives and managers utilize the best encryption possible on credit card data if it will be traveling over the internet. However, your IT professionals will probably read this same standard as use the latest encryption algorithms on credit card data as it travels over any open network. Now let's move on to Standard 5. Protect all systems and networks from malicious software. This one is pretty straightforward again. You probably use antivirus software like Norton or McAfee on your home computer. This standard wants us to do the same thing, but at the organizational level with a few extra pieces of software that add more sophistication. IT professionals will comply with this standard by using antivirus software on your network, and they'll often pair it with endpoint detection and response software like CrowdStrike or Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, which both add another layer of protection. I don't have time to get into the specifics of antivirus on this video, and while I do recommend it, I must offer a word of caution about it. It's not a silver bullet. I read about a hacker who walked into a computer store, connected to the store Wi-Fi, pulled up the Wi-Fi admin console, and logged in with the username admin and the password admin. At that point, he owned their network. Now, being a non-malicious hacker, he then showed the store employees what he was just able to do. The sad thing is, antivirus software would not have protected the computer store from this type of attack. And this is how most modern-day hacks occur. Weak passwords, ports open to the internet, and phishing scams. Antivirus will help a little with these attacks, but it usually will not stop them. This is also a good place to interject that the number of tools used to detect and defend against malicious software is virtually endless, and you could spend your entire company budget purchasing and running them all. So to combat this, we recommend two things. One, hire a pen tester to try to get into your network. A pen tester will quickly find your network's weak spots so that you can focus on those and get the maximum bang for your security budget dollar. And the second thing I recommend is lean heavily on the IT professionals working inside your company already for their knowledge. They know your network and can steer you towards the most relevant security tools. Next, we move on to Standard 6. Develop and maintain secure systems and software. In October of 2016, Uber was hacked, and 57 million drivers and their clients' records were exposed. It turns out that attackers found a hard-coded access key, which is akin to a password, in an Uber software developer's code repository. The hackers then used this key to access the customer data in the cloud. This goes to show that no matter how smart the IT people working underneath you are, mistakes can still happen, which is why we have PCI DSS Standard 6. Standard 6 says, develop and maintain secure systems and software. Generally speaking, Standard 6 directs us to follow cybersecurity best practices when developing software, as well as best practices for maintaining software, like applying software patches and upgrades when necessary. If we want to build an analogy of this standard, imagine building a fence around your house. When you do this, you'll probably put a gate somewhere along the fence line, and you are probably going to put a lock on that gate. You are not going to put all the time and effort into building a fence only to leave yourself without the ability to lock up your property. Just like we need to think about security when doing a project around the house, we need to think about security when developing projects for our organization. Your IT professionals will ensure that software developed in-house avoids hard-coded passwords, includes input validation, and that both custom and vendor software is patched when needed. Now let's move on to Standard 7. Restrict access to system components and cardholder data by business need to know. This one means that if someone's job does not require them to have access to sensitive credit card data, then they should not have access. Normally, one of the most surprising things people find when they receive a government security clearance for the first time is the fact that just because they have a clearance to view classified data does not mean that they get to see any and all classified data. To view classified documents, a federal employee must have the appropriate clearance and what the government calls a need to know. Because of this, there are many people with security clearances who see very little classified data throughout their whole career. Because if they don't need to see classified data to do their job, the government is not going to show it to them. Another good example is Fort Knox, the famed gold repository of the United States. Fort Knox is first and foremost a U.S. Army military base. This means that there are many soldiers walking around on Fort Knox. Now sure, they may be inside Fort Knox, but there is no way they are getting into the buildings holding the gold reserves unless they are a Department of the Treasury employee. Standard 7 suggests the same idea. Just because someone is an employee at your organization doesn't mean that they should have access to customer credit card data. Only those who absolutely need it to perform their job duties should have it. Your IT professionals will see this as the principle of least privilege, and should see to it that all access to credit card data and systems be centrally controlled in Active Directory when possible via something called security group membership. There are other methods of restricting access, but Active Directory security groups is the most common. Now let's look at Standard 8. Standard 8. Identify users and authenticate access to system components. This standard explicitly states that all users should have to authenticate to systems with sensitive credit card data. I worked in a retail store when I was a teenager. Each time we went to ring up a customer's purchase, we had to input our employee ID into the cash register to start the purchase process. This was done to not only allow us access to the company purchase and sales system to process the transaction, but also for tracking. This ended up being really important because while working there, I had a coworker that we'll call Travis. Now I noticed that Travis had not worked a shift for a while, so I asked a manager where he was and why he had not been to work in a while. It turns out that Travis was fired for stealing money from the cash register, and they tracked it down by noticing that every day that Travis was there ringing up customers, the till would be short. And the days that he was not there, the till would be balanced out at the end of the day. We could track this down because Travis was inputting his employee ID every time he rung up a customer, proving that he was on shift the days the till would come up short. Travis inputting his employee ID every time he rung up a customer is akin to him authenticating to the company purchase and sale database. Notice it was his authentication that was the starting point for the investigation of the lost cash. Executives and managers. This means each employee needs a unique ID, and they should have to input that unique ID to access sensitive systems containing credit card data. IT professionals will do this by ensuring each user with access to credit card data and systems has a unique user ID so we know exactly who is accessing sensitive systems. Standard 9. Restrict physical access to cardholder data. The famous Stuxnet hack against Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities uncovered in 2011 included USB drives being physically plugged into sensitive computers that were housed in a secure building and not connected to the internet. There was no way to get to these systems unless you were physically standing in front of them. The only people that could access these sensitive systems were trusted employees, but somehow one of them was tricked or maybe bribed into plugging malicious USB drives into these systems. Seeing how almost any human can be tricked into hacking their own facilities, it pays to minimize the number of individuals who have access and could damage your systems or steal your data. Many of you have had corporate jobs, so you're probably used to the idea of having a company ID that you use to badge in to doors. But even with that ID, there were probably still rooms you could not access. This standard refers to the same idea. One of our senior pen testers was tasked with performing an external pen test using social engineering. He placed custom malware on 20 USB drives and mailed them to his point of contact at the client company. His point of contact within the company casually left these USBs sitting in the break room and around the office. Sure enough, eventually one of the employees plugged in one of the malicious USB drives, probably out of simple curiosity, and at that point the USB drive then installed malware on that employee's computer. Now because of this, at this point, our pen tester was inside the client network. As always, minimizing the number of people with physical access to sensitive systems minimizes the probability of something bad happening. So, executives and managers restrict access to physical locations housing sensitive credit card data to authorized personnel only. IT professionals will look at this standard as though it is halfway between cybersecurity and physical security, since the most straightforward way to comply with this standard is to require employee badges for access to physical areas containing sensitive credit card data. So do what makes sense. Don't let anyone that does not absolutely need physical access to systems containing credit card data have that access. Standard 10. Log and monitor all access to system components and cardholder data. I used to work at an organization with an operations floor where the rule was simple. If your shift started at 0800, you needed to be at your position and ready for the shift change briefing at 0800. One guy, however, kept missing the shift change briefing by 20 to 30 minutes, which was frustrating because then the team lead had to take time out to fill him in on what was shared during the shift briefing. When confronted about his perpetual lateness, this guy always had excuses. Either he was in the bathroom or chatting with a manager in the hall. Luckily, every employee had to wear a badge, and this badge had to be scanned to get in the front door. So to get to the bottom of this issue, we checked the front door entry logs for the past month, and sure enough, he was regularly coming in the front door 20 to 30 minutes late. Luckily, he was fired shortly after. The two reasons we were able to confirm his lateness is 1, he had to badge in or authenticate to get into the front door. If you remember, PCI DSS covers this authentication requirement with Standard 8, which is identify users and authenticate access to system components. But Standard 10, the requirement to log and monitor access, is just as important in this scenario. If those front door event logs were not sent to a central repository for us to review later, we would not have been able to prove the employee's tardiness over the past month. So executives and managers, ensure you have a system in place to record and save who accesses credit card data and when they access it. IT professionals will do this by setting up authentication and event logging on systems containing credit card data. Preferably, those systems will then shoot those logs over to an aggregator like Syslog, Elk, or Splunk so they can be reviewed later. Here's another story of why logging and monitoring is important. At a different company I used to work for, we were concerned about protecting the company's intellectual property, so we started monitoring and logging who used company printers as well as what it was that they were printing up. And what do you know? Soon after, we observed a user printing an enormous amount of protected IP. At this point, we gathered what data we could and passed the situation off to HR and our legal department. I don't know what happened after that, but I do know that the employee in question no longer works at that company. Once again, we were able to catch said behavior because we had proper logging and monitoring of sensitive systems in place. This is what Standard 10 is all about. Now let's go ahead and look at Standard 11. Standard 11. Test security of systems and networks regularly. One of our pen testers was working an internal pen test for a customer and was struggling to elevate privileges from standard user to domain admin because the client was really good at cybersecurity and had blocked all of his normal attack vectors. Frustrated, he knew he had to start thinking outside of the box on this one. Then he stumbled across a random printer utilizing default credentials. Fortunately, this printer was programmed to talk to the client domain admin controller using domain administrator credentials in clear text. So our pen tester launched a man-in-the-middle attack using his attack box to pose as the company domain controller. The printer then sent him its pre-programmed domain admin creds in clear text, and at that point he had domain creds and it was game over. He owned the network. Now, if there is too much technobabble in that story for you, just walk away knowing this. He used a printer to hack the network. The moral of the story is that even when your IT team is really good at what they do, the often frustrating fact is that often pen testers will highlight one or two hard-to-find vulnerabilities that could spell disaster for the organization. This is why PCI DSS Standard 11 directs us to test the security of systems and networks regularly. Executives and managers, make sure that your organization is regularly testing for weaknesses in your network and systems. Pen testing and vulnerability scanning are the common ways to meet this standard. So look into what type of testing your organization is required to perform and how often. For instance, many organizations complying with PCI DSS are required to have a pen test and a vulnerability scan performed on their organization every year. Your IT professionals should be scheduling pen testing and vulnerability scans. Zerolag Security specializes in pen testing, and because our customers rely on us to ensure that they are in compliance, we are consistently booked a few months in advance. Here's another example of why testing and scanning is necessary. In February of 2017, a printer manufacturer had left certain software ports open by default, so the machines were shipped to their customers with this vulnerability pre-installed. When a non-malicious hacker found out about it, he was able to hack into over 150,000 devices across the internet and print out some kind of funny messages like the one you see on the screen, which warned organizations that their printers had been hacked. The key takeaway from this is that these companies were hacked, and it wasn't even their IT team's fault. It was actually the printer manufacturer's fault. This is another example of how pen testers and vulnerability scanners can uncover these difficult-to-find security holes in an organization. Now let's look at the final PCI DSS standard, Standard 12. Standard 12, support information security with organizational policies and programs. Now, phishing has long been a primary vector for hackers to steal credentials, and user education programs are often key to combating phishing schemes. CISA, the U.S. government cybersecurity organization, found that 8 out of 10 organizations fell for phishing schemes orchestrated by their security assessment teams. I read about a cybersecurity professional that was tasked with running a phishing campaign in his organization to gather statistics on how many users fell for the scam. He knew that there was a Seattle's Best coffee shop across the street from his office, so he registered a web domain akin to something like freeseattlesbestpromo.com, and then he blasted out emails inside the company asking people to sign up and create an account to receive a free Seattle's Best coffee gift card. He even sent out the free gift cards to make it legitimate. Surprisingly or unsurprisingly, he reported that 70 to 80% of the users that created an account to receive their free coffee gift card reused their company passwords to do so. This is a very sneaky way to steal credentials since most people reuse their passwords. Now, how do we combat this? Well, one of the primary methods is user education. There are other methods as well, but I'm going to put those in another video. Information security policies and programs are often taken for granted, but for better or for worse, they really are foundational for good information security. They're like the lock on the front door of a house. Most people take it for granted, and sure, it can be bypassed, but often it is the first obstacle a would-be attacker has to work around. So executives and managers, Company policies and programs around information security should be put in place for a few reasons. One is for liability, two is to encourage employees to adopt good information security habits, and three is for compliance. The second one, good information security habits, will go a long way to prevent phishing attacks from being successful. Information security policies and programs that IT will implement include acceptable use policies and annual user security awareness training. User education programs may not be exciting or sexy, and users will often push back on them, but they provide a lot of bang for your cybersecurity buck. Okay, great. Now we have a good understanding of the 12 different PCI DSS standards, but who do these standards apply to? Well, it applies to organizations that store, process, or transmit cardholder data and/or sensitive authentication data, as well as organizations that can impact the security of a cardholder data environment. Now, that's an official but terribly general and bland statement. Its only redeeming quality being that it is actually pretty accurate. Regardless, let's extract the intent of the quote and outline a more detailed explanation. There are three types of organizations that PCI DSS applies to. One is merchants. Merchants are any business or entity that accepts payment cards like credit and debit cards. Retail stores, restaurants, and hotels are examples of merchants. If they are a business that accepts credit cards as payment, they are a merchant by the PCI DSS definition. Another type of organization subject to PCI DSS is what is known as service providers. Service providers are businesses that handle, process, or store credit card information on behalf of merchants. Think of payment gateways like PayPal or Stripe, point-of-sale systems like Square, or data storage providers like AWS or Azure, which can hold credit card data. These are classified as service providers under PCI DSS. The third type of organization subject to PCI DSS is acquirers. An acquirer is an entity that works as a liaison between the merchant and the card networks. Card networks meaning entities like Visa or MasterCard. Acquirers are usually banks, but can also include other organizations that are specialized payment processing companies. Some good examples of acquirers are regional organizations like credit unions and major banks like JP Morgan Chase or Bank of America. All three of these entities have slightly different PCI DSS compliance requirements based on their entity type and how many transactions per year they engage in. I can break down these requirements in another video if you want, but in the meantime, let me give you 3 places you can go to find out the requirements specific to your organization. If you are a merchant, you can start with the bank that services your credit card transactions, known as your acquirer. This is the most reasonable path forward for small to mid-sized merchants. If you are not a merchant and you are a larger organization, you can hire a PCI DSS compliance consultant who can tailor your compliance program to your organization's exact requirements. At the very least, you can go to the PCI DSS website to read about the standards yourself. This website is PCIsecuritystandards.org. So that's it. If by producing this video we made your life just a little bit easier in any way, please let us know in the comments or by leaving a like. If you know of someone else who would probably rather watch this video than research PCI DSS themselves, then please share it with them. But if none of the above applies to you, no worries. Thanks for hanging out with us. We'll see you in the next video.